Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Delbo Rohach and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. As always, I'm joined by Julia Joja, who teaches at Georgetown, George Washington Universities, and works also at the Middle East Institute as a senior fellow focused on Black Sea security. Our special guest today is Dan Hamilton from the Brookings Institution and Johns Hopkins University. On our podcast, we tend to discuss security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front, so to speak. I mean, there has been a flurry of news, not just from the Eastern Front, narrowly defined, but also from the United States, where the president-elect has been making announcements of his nominees for some of the key national security positions for the Secretary of State, for the Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, Director of National Intelligence. Obviously, there has been a lot of sort of commotion around these nominations, and there might be some pushback perhaps coming from Senate Republicans. But I wonder, Julia, if you have any thoughts on what these moves and these early signals coming from the emerging Trump administration mean for Ukraine and Eastern Europe.
I tried yesterday to sum up to a Romanian audience the nominations and what they mean for the region, and I tried to package it as positively as possible because they didn't want to hear that things can turn. But I really had trouble because if you're looking into the nomination for Pentagon, for Attorney General, for the National Intelligence Agency, these are all people that have, if not very problematic, at least troubling approaches vis-a-vis international affairs generally. Many of them seem to take either only the China threat seriously or no foreign policy threats seriously. And when it comes to Russia specifically, I feel like it gets even more problematic. And then the other side, if you try to find the full part of the glass, it's Rubio for state and it is Waltz for national security advisor, but that's also only by comparison. And even then, it's a bit difficult to see any kind of little light at the end of the tunnel when it comes to Ukraine specifically. Basically, at this point, it's really hard if you're looking at the Assembly on Foreign Policy and National Security. It's really hard to find anything encouraging for Europe or alliances altogether, let alone for Ukraine. I feel like it's a group of people that many, if not all of them, think that Ukraine is a weak, corrupt country with no nuclear weapons, poor country, and many of them have almost mysterious appreciation for Russia. So that's all I can say at the broad level. But Dalibor, would you want to add a little to it?
Yes, I'm definitely not going to contradict you in any of that. I mean, I think that we should be, we could be spending a fair amount of time kind of reflecting on the sheer sort of grotesque unsuitability, incompetence of some of these nominations. I mean, when you think of Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, it's off the charts insane as a pick for the Director of National Intelligence. I know this is not an original insight, many have said it before, but I think we should just continue being shocked and make it clear publicly that this is just something that is just sort of out of this world, sort of unthinkable, to nominate somebody who traveled in 2017 to Syria to hang out with Assad as Assad was murdering Syrians with Putin's assistance, where there are real questions about, what, if anything, she was getting in return for carrying the water for the Assad regime for Putin. And so I would just want to sort of keep that sort of sense of sort of shock in our heads as we sort of discuss policy. Obviously, as you said, there is very little kind of interest or patience that this cadre of people have for Ukraine, and I think that's illustrated by some of the reactions that we've seen already from the Trump world to the Biden administration's decision to authorize the use of ATACMS against targets on Russian territory, where basically in unison, Don Jr., nominee for national security, Waltz, and I suppose others have, warned against the dangers of escalation. And it's funny how that sort of echoes what the Kremlin has been saying, how how it echoes what Hungary's foreign minister Szijjártó has been saying. People are kind of like worried about escalating, and somehow, when sort of Russians throw in North Korean troops into the meat grinder, or just pummel Ukrainian cities, killing civilians on a daily basis, striking against targets that have no military value, that somehow is kind of like the default situation we are dealing with. We are not seeing it through the prism of Russian escalation, which is very strange. So we are sort of applying a standard to ourselves that we are not applying to the Russians. But I suppose that's the world Ukraine will have to navigate, and that Eastern Europeans will have to navigate going forward. And I think, so I've been having many conversations with kind of center-right friends in Washington and beyond, and people are kind of like latching to the memory of 2017, 2019, the first Trump administration, and like, Republicans in charge of various policy portfolios. And I just think that really sort of understates the danger Eastern Europe is in, and the sort of uncharted territory we are entering with this new Trump administration. I don't want people to panic, and it's not necessarily helpful to say the sky is falling, but boy, we have to prepare for a very different world.
Yeah, your last comment about Central Eastern Europeans on the center right engaging in wishful thinking is exactly what I was referring to when I said earlier that my audience yesterday didn't want to hear the bad things relevant to the region and to Ukraine because of that. And one of the questions that I got was, but if you draw the line, the Trump administration has done for our country so much better, so much more than the Biden administration or the Obama administration that came before. And, how is this different? And it always goes back to the same point. In the first administration, we had people like McMaster, Bolton, Kelly, and beyond. And in this administration, we will have people like the ones that we've just mentioned, let alone the fact that we also have a history of Trump dismissing people. I counted that in the 4 years, if you count the interim national security advisors, Trump went through 6. And the first one, if you remember, Flynn, lasted 24 days. So that too tells us that this is in full flux. And my takeaway was put your seatbelts on, because we really don't know what's coming. And the policy that they're describing today could be completely contradicted the next day. I think here too, there's a reasoning that maybe you've heard too, that Trump is so unpredictable that Putin will not risk anything more. But right now, I feel like we're engaging in a cognitively not, I don't know how to describe it, not rational situation. So the nuclear doctrine, according to Putin and the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, has been changed so that essentially an attack of Ukraine with military aid, in this case ATACMS, that are provided by a nuclear state, is considered reason for a nuclear attack of Russia. And so what does that mean? Ukraine fired already some ATACMS overnight, according to initial reports. Ukraine is in Kursk. That too has completely violated all Russian red lines when it comes to the doctrine. And yet we're seeing this mirroring and imitating of language that has very little credibility in the Kremlin at this point, but is being mirrored and imitated either in Budapest or in, I would say, Washington, but none of these people are in Washington at the moment, I think, in the surroundings of Mar-a-Lago.
So it's funny that you frame it in those terms, because basically what you're suggesting is that the sort of best picture that you can paint of what's coming is that there'll be chaos, and perhaps that chaos will sort of lead to policy change, perhaps in a more constructive direction, and that's probably, really the best we can sort of hope for. At the same time, it is true that unlike in 2017, 2019, you'll have the Trump team populated by people who do have policy ideas, who have very strong priors, who don't want to allow the so-called neocons or globalists anywhere near levers of power. And I think they'll be busy implementing those ideas. And actually, when things backfire, it's not clear to me that they will care that much. The whole premise of much of this movement is that, what happens to Ukraine is of no concern to Americans, essentially, that we should not get embroiled in this conflict. So I don't think that unpredictability really applies here, because it's perfectly predictable that the sort of response of the Trump team is that, yeah, we don't really care, Europeans should deal with this. And actually, I'm not alarmed, but I'm wondering, like, what the Russians might be thinking about this nuclear doctrine business in response to ATACMS. I mean, we are in a situation in which you have a departing administration that made this call, after massive delay, should have come earlier, should not have been preceded by a long-winded public conversation about this. But now we have another administration incoming that will take probably a much softer line on Russia. If Putin wanted to, escalate to de-escalate, now might not be a bad time to do it, because it is very likely. So I don't want to like give anybody ideas or be alarmist, but if you were Putin and wanted to kind of draw a red line after many have been crossed, like, why not send a small nuke somewhere, like to Ukraine, like today? You know that the Biden administration will not be in a position to respond. You'll know that the sort of like pro-Russian voices on the MAGA right will say, look how irresponsible Biden has been. We have to make peace with Russia as soon as possible. I think that will actually strengthen his bargaining position going forward.
Indeed, the argument seems to have been from the Trump people and Trump himself that this is Biden's war. He wants it done and resolved, just like the one in the Middle East, by the time he's in. But from a Russian perspective, indeed, this is the moment in which the United States is in the weakest position and the possible costs are the lowest. If you do a cost-benefit analysis, which I think the Russians are inclined to do constantly. And then the question indeed is, and to you, Dalibor, because I have not been able to make sense of this, what is the Biden administration thinking? They're thinking, well, we've been driven by fear of escalation so far, but now that we're leaving, we just don't care anymore about the risks, including to the United States, or?
No, I think they've sort of run through the same cycle as before, that they keep talking about this 6-month cycle. They finally said yes after, like, Russians have been bombing Ukrainian cities and apartment buildings and just been thoroughly sort of reckless in brutalizing the Ukrainian population. And I guess there is a sort of point at which Americans say, okay, well, fire away. Obviously, part of this is to help Ukraine strengthen its bargaining position going forward. So if they can hold on to that Kursk territory, that is at least something they can trade when Trump comes and starts negotiating. And I suppose the hope is that this might help them hold on to that piece of Russian territory until January. But I don't think it's a sort of deeply sort of calculated move on the US side. It's just like the sort of Ukrainian pressure has been too big, and we've been sort of going through this conversation for so long that at some point, they sort of lift their arms in the air and say, okay, go ahead. And it's true that, like, at this point, it's not going to change the fundamental character of the war, but it is a dangerous moment, just given the transition here, and given the fact that we sort of know that the incoming administration will take a much softer view of Russia.
Troubling times ahead. Before we go into the next section, you referenced, I think both of us did, the ample connections and the state of flux between Washington, the result of the elections and the nominations here, and what is going on the Eastern Front itself. So before we move on, I wanted to offer a primer of what you should be expecting in the next few weeks from another round of elections taking place, this time in my country of origin, Romania, that I talk about very little on the podcast, but it is the second biggest country on the front or flank, and it has the longest border to Ukraine. So what happens in Romania is indeed important. And in these elections are very important. They last 3 weeks, 3 Sundays in a row, starting with the coming Sunday, with 2 rounds of presidential elections and 1 legislative parliamentary election. But the most important one is the first round this Sunday that will decide who's going to the second round in the presidential elections. Romania is changing its president after 10 years, and the president has powers over foreign policy, extended powers, so it's very important. And the only way I can describe describe it in a, I guess, enticing or attractive way is by going in 1 minute or so through the candidates and their chances as we're looking into Sunday. Beyond a number of smaller candidates that are still shuffling and reshuffling numbers, including on the center right, we have in hierarchical order from the lowest chances to the highest chances to make it to president, the former prime minister of the center right, who is a general, beloved here, but has limited chances to make it to the second round. And one of the problems that he has is that he said he fought in Iraq when actually turns out he didn't. After that, we have the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Mircea Joană, who's running as independent. He ran before and lost with the biggest parties, the Social Democrats, but this time he's running as independent after the party kicked him out twice. He looked like he's having significant chances, but now he's losing, so smaller chances to make it to the second round, perceived as very pro-Western, obviously coming from NATO, but also with a complicated checkered past, including in connection to corruption allegations and Russia ties. And that leads us then to number 3, catching up in the polls, the only woman who's running on an anti-corruption party platform. She's perhaps the one with the sort of least corrupt or cleanest background, catching up in the polls, but still trailing in number 3. And then it becomes interesting because we have in number 2 the far right on the rise, with the head of the party, young guy, who wears MAGA hats, is a big fan of Trump, but is banned from entering either Moldova or Ukraine for being anti-Ukrainian, anti-Moldovan, and accused of having ties to the FSB in Russia. And the problem with this guy and this party is also that the majority of observers believe that he's helped by the mainstream parties to make it to the second round so that the mainstream Social Democrats could win, which would be a very big dream for them. They are now in number 1, but they haven't had the presidency in 20 years. And the current prime minister is running for president and is in the polls number 1, so most likely to win. We'll know more about who is going to win actually just on Monday next week, because depending on the combination that we have in the second round, we'll almost certainly have a win for one or the other 2 weeks ahead announced. So I'll keep us in the loop, but it is a complicated equation in which the United States and Ukraine play very big roles in foreign policy, is unlike other times at the forefront of these elections.
Fascinating stuff. I wonder how much the sort of US politics will kind of drive the conversation in Romania, and whether it will sort of bring out the best or worst in people going forward. I think that's a sort of big question for European politics at large. Let us now turn to our special guest, Dan Hamilton, who's a non-resident fellow at Brookings and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Dan, it's great to have you on the podcast. We discussed in the first segment with Julia the recent developments on this side of the Atlantic, the staffing of the new emerging Trump administration and its likely policies on Ukraine. And I think if there is one element of the puzzle that is already clear, it is that the new administration will require Europeans to step up in a major way, both in maintaining peace in Ukraine, if there is a peace deal struck, in helping Ukraine eventually join the community of European liberal democracies, join the EU, etc., etc. So you returned from Germany. I presume you had conversations about the incoming administration with your German interlocutors, and you also get some insights into what the German thinking is about their own role in Europe in this changing landscape. So if you could sort of give us a very brief summary of what really stood up to you during your visit, that would be helpful.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here with you. You know, the German government coalition has collapsed, and so they're heading to new elections with a vote of no confidence in December and then the elections in February. If it goes to that plan, things can change. And so my impression is, and this is sort of the example of it, Germany is really stuck. The country, unfortunately, has so much potential. It's Europe's central power, biggest economy. It's right in the middle of the continent, so many neighbors, and yet it hasn't adjusted to the new reality, that we are in an age of disruption. Which constant disruption is going to be the only constant, really. And that is deeply unsettling to a society and a country that had based everything on stability, on predictability, on the idea of interdependence brings peace. And so the German model, had become reliant on Russia for energy, China for its markets, the United States for security, and there wasn't any deeper thinking about that. Germany was the biggest beneficiary of the end of the Cold War, and also one could argue, 20 years afterward, Germany was prospering in that post-Cold War space. But that world is over, and the German debate hasn't caught up to that. It's deeply unsettling. It's almost petrifying for this society to try to cope with that. So I think what you're going to see, whatever the election is, still a grasping for security, stability in their choices for their parties in the election. And it only become clearer once you have a new coalition that they have to step up in so many other ways, almost mentally is more important than any specific policy. It's hard to predict. It does look like the CDU would be the leading partner in any coalition government, but who the other partners would be is, too early to tell. But I think the backdrop is a deeply unsettled society realizing its old model is gone, but unable to really come to terms with what its new position could be.
But it's really interesting because, this is not the first time that Germany finds itself in a situation like this. After Trump's first election, Angela Merkel would talk at great lengths about the need for Europeans and Germans to take their own destiny into their own hands. We had Zeitenwende in 2022. The writing has been on the wall for a very, very long time. Do you have any sense that especially the CDU leadership can rise to the occasion? Should they form a new cabinet? Will we finally see a sort of new, more energetic, more assertive Germany capable of leading Europe? Or are you somewhat more pessimistic of that prospect?
Well, it reaches deeper than a coalition government. It's deeply rooted in the society and the model of that society as it developed during the Cold War and during the post-Cold War years. And so it's a fundamental challenge to Germany's self-perception. It runs much deeper than who's going to be chancellor. And that's why a chancellor will have to engage the German public in a very hard sort of reflection. If you think about the German business community, for instance, their model isn't working. They know it, but they don't know how to get out of it. They are now, deeply dependent on China's markets, and China is becoming Germany in a way. The Chinese model now of economic development is to basically become the kind of manufacturing export powerhouse that Germany was, and it's stealing its own markets from the Germans as it goes along and keeps going up the technological ladder. So that is deeply unsettling. And then, as I say, you have now the United States also under the Trump administration basically did not believe that European integration is in the interest of the United States. That is deeply unsettling to a German public that believes, being locked in and embedded within these overlapping structures of Europe is its security guarantee. And then you have Russia, the third protagonist, also willing and able to disrupt the European experiment. So Germany and Europe are facing the fact that their three main protagonists, the United States, China, and Russia, each for their own reasons, are intent on divvying up the Europeans, playing them off against each other, not sort of, becoming stakeholders in the European project, but spoilers. And at a time when the European model, as they say, is really under some strain, with Germany at the heart of it. So it goes beyond any particular government. I do believe Friedrich Merz, if he would be the chancellor, has a sense of these things. He has had business experience. He comes from the conservative camp. I think he's more agile than some other conservative politicians in Germany when it comes probably dealing with Donald Trump. He has been critical on the Russia dependencies and on the China dependencies, but he'll be in a coalition, maybe with the Social Democrats again. So it's very hard to predict right now. But my point is mainly it's a deep, deep challenge to Germany's self-concept, and that is not something you get out of anytime easily or soon.
I want to pick up on that and broaden a bit further the lens and ask you to what does then Trump coming back mean to the Europeans and particularly to the transatlantic relations. You've been looking at the transatlantic relations for a long, long time. And when I listen to the Europeans these days after US elections, it seems that they're saying something very different from you. And it's a bit what Dalibor was saying over and over again, the same rhetoric, but with little behind. Now is our moment. We got to get our act together. Trump is not going to help us anymore. And Trump, now, preparation of the second term, seems to like Europe less than he even did before, seems to be more skeptical of the idea of an internationalist United States, of alliances and partnerships. The Europeans, of course, know it, but what does that look like in a year or two from now? Do you expect more trade wars with the European Union? Do you think Trump will be just set on the commercial aspect in the relationship that, of course, has Germany at the center? If we're talking about transatlantic trade, and is he just about to just focus on fixing the deficits? Are the threats that we're hearing over the last 2 weeks from J.D. Vance about if Europe intends to regulate the X platform, then the United States will withdraw funding from NATO and not contribute to Ukraine reconstruction? Does that have any seriousness in your understanding, or is it just mere threats? What are you most concerned about looking ahead into the next year or so?
I believe the Trump administration will pursue an unsentimental, transactional, interest-based policy as it understands it, in which the main competitor, the world-class systemic peer competitor, is China. That'll be the focus. And Russia, also a declining power in their view, but could be dangerous and unpredictable, so you don't want to fool around with that. But one way to do that is to take Russia off the table by working with Putin. Well, whether that happens, I can't tell you. But the implication for Europe is that type of approach means you want to rebalance your burdens because the perception the U.S. has been carrying too many burdens for too long that's unfair, that you want to either refurbish institutions that haven't been working or are leaving them or abandoning them and just going out on your own, and demanding more of others that they do, help you if they can, or if not, get out of the way. So the implication for Europe is I don't believe the Trump administration, I think Donald Trump governs by instinct. He's a gut politician. So it's hard to ever say there's a particular strategy or anything. Anybody who has worked with him says, it depends on the day. But often in Trump 1 administration, often his advisors, the institutions around him, the agencies, were able to balance that temperamental approach to governing with a temperance, if you will, that meant that the ultimate policy wasn't always what was being said. So we'll see how that plays out now. But I think the temperament will be to say there is nothing Europe can do to help us with China. I don't think Donald Trump by instinct thinks of Europe as a partner on China. He says it's worse than China, just smaller. That's what he's been saying. So the best way that Europe could help on China is to pay for its own defense. That would be the burden sharing, not to fool around with policies on China with the United States, but to just, pick up itself and do its own job. Now, that'll be tempered, I think, by lots of other types of proposals the European Union might come with on subsidies and buying gas and things like that. But that'll be the ingoing instinct. And I think that's going to be very unnerving for European policymakers. The terms, the vocabulary even will be different. We just spent 4 years talking about de-risking with China, getting to a point where we have the same language. That'll be out the door on day one. The Trump administration prefers decoupling. Either some believe it, others don't believe it, but they know it's a tactical approach to extract the best concessions you can from China. But that term is deeply unsettling to Europeans who know you can't decouple, or they can't decouple exactly. The Trump administration and officials called China the enemy. The enemy. That term is deeply unsettling in Europe. Just the term applied to anybody, even to Russia right now. It's very hard for Europeans to talk about the enemy, unless you're in Ukraine and some Central European countries. So the vocabulary that we're going to hear and this temperamental gut instinct is going to get in the way of the relationship just from the day one, because we speak different language when we do this. So what's behind it, we'll have to work out, but I think it'll be very hard to get this on track. How can you build up a cooperative approach when you're in a tariff war with each other? And, that is likely also to happen on day one. Tariff war, day one. He said it. Some of his advisors say the first target will be Europe, not China. Whether that's true or not, I can't tell you. But I think these are the dynamics we have to think about. It has huge implications then for Ukraine and for Russia and European security.
In the first Trump administration, the staffing was a largely moderating influence on policy outcomes because obviously the Trump campaign didn't really expect to win, wasn't prepared to take over the government. And so you ended up with many of the sort of conventional internationalist-minded Republicans staffing the key posts at the White House, State Department, DOD, and elsewhere. And I think many Europeans are sort of hoping that something similar might be at play this time around as well. At the same time, I think we saw a campaign that was much better sort of geared towards actually taking over the government with much clearer understanding of what sort of policies they wanted to implement and how they would be different from conventional Republican policies of the past. Where do you see the sort of balance between the more traditional fusionist, internationalist-minded Republican factions in the future administration as opposed to the sort of burn it all down MAGA crowd? And what precautionary measures should Europeans be taking now in this 2-month interim period while they still can?
So 2 questions there. So on the first one, this time Trump won handily. He does believe he has a mandate from the American people to govern. And you can see that there isn't any contestation of that, frankly, from the Democrats. And so you can see with his picks, he is demanding loyalty. He is identifying individuals who will be loyal. And he is sending a clear message to them that he is in charge. He will make the decisions. So even Waltz or Rubio, who many point to as more traditional choices, know in the end it's not their policy. He's going to decide. And so this is very different than Trump won. He has a clear sense, at least his instinct, as they say, is to think he knows what he wants to do, rather than last time where he was unsure for some time. And so I don't think it'll be like Trump won. You can see his nomination of a number of individuals is to test the Republican Senate on how compliant they are with the president. You know, as some of the commentators are saying, it's the flood the zone approach. You send them so many unconventional candidates that you're challenging them. You know, you might stop 1 or 2, but you're really going to stop all of them? And so it's a test. It's a test of loyalty to the Senate. And so when you say, where is the trend? I think the test will come first in the U.S. Senate, not in the incoming administration. It will be the Senate that, approves the nominees. It's the Senate that approves, later picks assistant secretaries and all of that, and ambassadors. So the test will be, the newly elected majority leader, John Thune from South Dakota. Is he his own man? Is he ready to buck the president to preserve the integrity of the U.S. Senate or not? I think that'll be more the question. Because in Trump 1, if you remember, often the president's instinct was to declare something that deeply unsettled the Europeans, like questioning NATO, pulling troops out of Germany, zero out funding for U.S. forces in Europe, and they were all denied by the U.S. Senate, by Republicans in the U.S. Senate. It was the U.S. Senate, NATO enlarged 2 times during Trump's first term, even though the president said he didn't really like it. It was because the senators made this choice. They were the ones that put funding back in for NATO, even though the administration wanted to take it out. So I think the real test will become not within the administration, but between the Senate and the executive branch. I think that's going to be the inner Republican dynamic. So what Europeans have to focus on is always to remember this is not a parliamentary system. The president doesn't come out of the Congress. The Congress has also certain powers. In 2 years, we're going to vote again for a third of the Senate and for the U.S. House of Representatives again. So we'll see what happens then. My guess is we'll have divided government in 2 years. So 2 years window is for the Trump administration where it basically has pretty free reign if the Senate is compliant. If it has its own sense of things, it'll be more difficult for the president on some key issues. I don't think that'll be China, though. I think there's a bipartisan consensus on China, and so that is not really party related. And that, back to all my points about China and how that affects Europe, I think will still apply.
Dan Hamilton, thank you so much for your insights and for this rather sobering conversation.
Thank you.
Let us now turn to third segment, our recommendations. Julia, I know you did an event recently with General Breedlove. Could you maybe tell us what the sort of key insights of this have been and why it is of interest to our listeners?
Absolutely. Not an event, rather a recommendation to listen in, not just to our podcast, but to an episode of my Institute's podcast, the Middle East Institute, where General Breedlove, former Supreme Commander of the U.S. forces in Europe and NATO forces, and in charge when Russia first invaded Ukraine. We've had him on the podcast as a guest here on the Eastern Front, and he worked with me as distinguished chair of the Black Sea program I'm running for years. So he and I are as guests in an episode that we just published with the Middle East Institute on 1,000 Days of War, which we're commemorating on November 19th. And it's a bit of a deep dive, not too long, but a bit of a deep dive into the operational and strategic levels of the war, the mistakes that we've seen, especially from the Western side in terms of decisions, strategy, policy, and also some very interesting and thoughtful insights into, from a military perspective and strategic perspective, what we can be expecting from both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side in the months to come as we're getting closer to the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion. So don't just listen to our podcast, listen to this one too.
Great. We'll link to it in the show notes. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast on security, politics and culture of Eastern Europe and on their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter, LinkedIn and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics you'd like us to cover on the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.